Okay, sorry, I thought that you meant kick as in kicking people out. So sorry. Um, um, just some kind of logistic stuff. First one is that I have realized that some of the groups, um, delegates don't have any NCAR delegated. So I realized that they cannot vote, and also I'm not sure whether that counts toward their voting rate. Is my understanding that it doesn't influence it, but just to be safe, and also I think to encourage, I will try. So I actually tried to go and delegate today. As some of you guys know, the gas price right now is ridiculous. So I realized that I will run out of eats if I do that. So I'll wait until if it's a little bit more reasonable, and I'll try to do it. I have pinpointed some of the members that were being more active and also provided feedback on both Excel, forum, and Discord. So appreciate that. But if you feel like that you're also being active and I just didn't like catch it, just let me know, and then I'll also try to delegate more. Of course, for us, like it's small, so it doesn't really like matter too much. But I also realized that we are in the initial phase where a lot of people, I don't think they know how it works. And at least from the constitution I checked, I think that delegation from CBC member counts toward it. So I think it's kind of for sure way of trying to boost our team. But of course, Patrick, others, if it's on constitution, please let me know before you decide to ban me. So thank you. Also, another logistic thing, which Rafael will also share some of it, is that so as some of you guys have noticed, we have been using Excel to have different clause to give improvements, right? Because one of the issue has been that a lot of different members give us the feedback, including on this call, as well as on the forum and on Discord, sometimes on DM. And those are all great, but the problem is that it's hard for me to keep track of it, especially since we also have other like responsibility and others, right? So I think that what we should do is that we should have a habit of if you have a clause that you want to improve, then so for now the document is managed by Rafael. So please reach out to Rafael to have access, so that you can go and edit it. And then you can. So right now we're gonna make some changes because for the one that we made, it was only for like specific scope, but we realized that people make recommendation on other scopes sometimes, and then I don't think it's necessarily like we have to be strict at saying like, oh, you have to only comment on these for a certain period, um, especially for the future ones, right? So I think we are gonna just create a new tabs and then have it for each scope. But actually, Rafa and I just talk about it, which is like we also need to clarify on how we can submit the recommendation. We were going to also write on the forum, but since also Gov Alpha team is here, maybe we can also touch on it a little bit as well. But if Gov Alpha needs more time to figure out, like we can also talk on the forum. But for Gov Alpha, the question also has been from our side is that, so we have several recommendations for a scope, so that's great. The question is, A, how do you actually submit it? Two is that, so for example, we have, let's say, like 10 different recommendations for single scope. For this, like, does the voting go up to basically 10 different recommendations to edit, or is it just per each? And then also, if we, for example, fails to pass the vote to get those implementations, like, does it matter whether we are like recognized or not? So I just want to maybe go up to talk briefly about this kind of meta thing before we talk more. But especially for today, okay, sorry. So Rafael has a hands up.
Yeah, sorry, I just discussed that with Patrick on the Discord forum, and maybe I can just share what he wrote. So basically, he said that the format should be a doc, but a sheet might also be acceptable at the current moment. And then these strategies actually don't get voted on, but are just there to inform delegates about like our opinion. And somebody has to write a MIP 102 proposal, and I'll just read it verbatim. And if your CVC position document is aligned with that proposal, then your delegates should vote for it. And if it was not aligned, then they should vote against it. Once we move out of pregame, the advisory council would review the documents and may propose changes based on their contents.
Okay, I will read the Discord again. But yeah, sorry, I didn't read that part. But thank you for the
Yeah,
clarification.
it was just like a minute ago. So, but I think as far as I've understood it, so actually, but this is interesting because then the question is like, if it doesn't get voted on anyway, what's the requirement for detail regarding the scope edits, for instance, right? Like we could then just basically work into positions, and then whoever writes the MIP 1 or 2, and delegates can decide.
Yeah, I'm actually not so clear about it. Gobop, I'm sorry to keep bringing up Gobop. I know that you guys are probably working overtime, but if you guys can provide some clarification, and also I see 3F Good Meta say that it was up. Okay, Patrick said no. Okay, we have a debate. Can you maybe explain more?
Well, you're talking about different things fundamentally here. So the first thing is, let's deal with Do's question, and then we can come on to what 3F Good Meta wants to chat about. So position document in and of itself doesn't cause a vote on chain, right? Which I think is where the confusion was coming from. So your position document is something that you've approved as a CVC that gets published. And then that should be used by your delegates when they're deciding their votes on different topics. There's nothing stopping you writing a full MIP 102 sub-proposal if you wanted to, but you don't have to. So your position document could say things like, we want to see edits that to this section of the decentralized collateral scope that focus on, reducing stability fees on things, that kind of high level topic. Or you could go as far as suggesting text. It's not specified anywhere how high or low level your things have to be. But what that then does is when your delegates are then looking at a change to the scope, and actually, Growth CVC have said we want to lower stability fees, and then there's a proposal that would increase them, they would then take that and say, well, my CVC wants lower stability fees. I'm therefore going to vote against this proposal that would raise stability fees. So that's kind of how the position documents work. Okay, there's no automatic process of them going up to a vote for maker holders. Someone would have to action that. In terms of what Frank was referencing was discussion on, let me find can you remember which channel it was in, Frank? Because I've kind of forgotten. Let me find it on Discord. Yeah, so you asked, is it similar to a MIP 102 proposal? No, it's not, because it's not a formal proposal, right? And then we'd gone on to discuss, whether or not it was constitutional to suggest edits to a scope, and I said yes, it is, because in and of themselves, edits aren't unconstitutional. It would only be if you were wanting to edit a scope in a way that would violate the Constitution that would be a problem. So I don't think that contradicts at all what I said, but feel free to tell me I'm wrong. And Code Knight's point in the chat, yes, the CVC themselves has to vote on something. So like the CVC members have to approve the position documents internally, but that's not that doesn't go up to like the voting portal.
Okay.
Working my way through the questions. What's an example of an unconstitutional edit? So like if editing the role of a delegate or CVC member in the arbitration scope in a way that contradicts the definition of a constitutional conserver in the Constitution would be an example of an unconstitutional edit, right? It would be it would be a direct violation of what the Constitution says. Well, you could do that, yeah. But we're thinking here in the very short term, right? But in in the medium term, in the long term, MIP 102 isn't going to exist anymore, and there's going to be a very different process for arranging things. But that was an example off the top of my head. But yeah, I'm sure there are other, once the constitution ossifies and is no longer able to be edited without great difficulty, then that would be an example of something that you couldn't change, right? And then I want to get this back to the Growth CVC because it's your call, not my call. But is there a template we can visualize? No. I believe Rune is planning to write one, but as of yet, I haven't seen anything along those lines. And Tim got that question. Right, back to you guys.
Okay, so to be clear, we as Growth CVC, we don't have the position document, right? Yet, right? Because I'm also a little confused. We did write about, for example, what Growth CVC wants to promote, but that's different, right? Because especially those that we also need to write about, what are some edits we want to see, right? That's from what I had understood. I mean, I'll try to go back and then rewatch it to fully understand what it means, but I think that's what you said. But
yeah, I think it becomes pretty crucial in practical terms, because the question is this: if this doesn't get voted on automatically, then I think there's little point in providing actual language to specific clauses, but then we would just focus on creating a more detailed strategic document that's basically like a research. Whereas if that enters into a MIP 102 proposal to amend the scopes, then we need to be clause by clause by clause by clause. So I think how the process works determines how the output should be. And so I think this question is actually something that is pretty important to solve, because it's at the moment it's up to the CVC. Okay, I mean, what would you prefer? I mean, I think then we can use the time to just source input and leave the actual writing of the language to the advisory council and facilitators, who would then write the proposals that go up for polls, right?
yeah, I think sure.
But I mean, we can think this through for some more time.
Yeah. Let's definitely think more about it. But so going back to the Growth ABC, so Rafael has prepared some of the agenda for today. So maybe you can lead it. And also, thank you so much for arranging and preparing.
Thank you too. Can I share screen? Then I can put it up here. Otherwise, I'll just read it. It's not super long.
I think you should have the ability to share your screen, but if not, Gobapa can maybe help with that.
I do not at the moment, but it's not a big thing. I can just read it. So I think at the moment we want to use the decentralized collateral to grow DAI supply and demand, and to contradict me at any moment if you feel that I'm going off the rails. And there are some specific questions around that. So I think one is, what options do delegates see? Okay, I can share now. One second, I think I have too many windows open. There we go. Yeah, that's good. So the question is, what kind of options do we have to grow DAI supply? And I've compiled the ones that I know of, but maybe I'm missing something else. So one is to just onboard more stuff into the PSM, like we did with Gemini and the proposal by Paxos, that grows potentially the supply of DAI, but also dependencies upon these centralized actors. And I think both GUSD and USDC are much higher than the surplus buffer is. So there's a existential risk there. And while more coins can seen as diversification, every diversification that is higher than the surplus buffer has this existential risk. Publica says this is entirely on the sub-DAO level. Okay, that's interesting. Are others also of this opinion? Is it then, because then we don't need to concern ourselves with this point, as there are no sub-DAOs.
But I think at the same time, like maybe details is up to sub-DAOs, but I think in terms of like general idea on what kind of voting that we support, I think it's fine to discuss it. But if not, we have a lot of I would say governance cops here who can tell us what's not allowed. So I think it's fine for now.
Okay. Well, I'll just run down a little bit through what we see, and maybe we can surface if there's anything else that I'm missing, just top level, without getting too much into the details. I think basically, and I think I'm almost sure this is going to go to the sub-DAOs. We can accept more decentralized collateral. I think there's always a cost issue and a bad debt issue. So I think this is something that I'll definitely see in the sub-DAO realm. And something that I'm actually very fond of is L2 efforts. And there was an excellent point by Derek, who just had a couple of questions, and I want to surface some opinions about that here. So basically, like, moving DAI to L2s has a couple of different flavors. And one is the concept that Hexonaut Sam also championed and started to develop, that's called canonical DAI. And the other is called rep DAI. And I think I would ask, like, what do you think is more conducive to growing DAI sustainably? Do you have any preference there?
I think that, I mean, especially from the growth side, we are, of course, have to also balance between expansion and also security and others. But correct me if I'm wrong, but so Rapta is the more efficient version, right? Because that we can just have one on east and then we can just bridge over. Is it correct?
Yeah, I think that RepDai just doesn't need any development effort. It's basically permissionless, whereas canonical DAI needs teleport. And, so I think that's something that has to be taken into account.
Yeah. I think this is true for other, like, I mean, this is true for delegates in general. It's like, I know that for Growth CVC, like the idea of growth sometimes I think it can be broad and it can be a little bit different understanding. But I think that as long as they can defend it, especially growth in the long term, I think that's fine. So if somebody can make a good point that, for example, having Rapta is better in the long term for growth, I think that's fine as well, or other way as well. Okay.
Okay. Then the question is, if we can see vaults on L2, I think that's pretty powerful if we can somehow get a handle on the risk. I don't know, what's your opinion there?
I actually don't have a particularly strong opinion on this one. Can you share your thoughts?
Maybe some of the delegates have some insight into like the specific risks that are associated with deploying vaults on L2s.
So I actually have to probably go back and actually read on it, but it so for this one, it's not on voting yet, right? So this is just for discussion. Is it correct?
Totally. I think it's just more like coming to a basic strategy that we as Growth CVC see in regard to decentralized collateral. So what I'm trying to get to is so the delegates have a much clearer picture about like what we as a Growth CVC support. And also there's a lot of things where I probably don't understand the ramifications. So for instance, deploying vaults and tools seems at first sight like a really good idea, right? For instance, why not, I don't know, like I just go off the rails here, but deploy a copy of Maker to Optimism, for instance, saying that there's Maker Optimism and people can use it there. But the question is that like, what am I missing there? Why is that a bad idea? So I think what I'm trying to get to is to come to a good understanding of all of us together of like how we can grow DAI on L2s and make on L2s, because I think this is a very important growth opportunity. But I want to use this session to just surface a couple of things that I might be missing, so and that others might not know about, so that we come to a shared understanding of like the challenges there.
Yeah, and I think that it would be maybe good to also look at like some of the other protocols, right? Like for example, not necessarily stablecoin, but we do see lending on other protocols, and sometimes they can get into trouble and the damage spill over. I've been personally looking at a lot with the Aave a little bit into the governance, because as some of you guys remember, Aave had an incident on Harmony, right? Like it was not Aave itself that was targeted per se, it was the Harmony that itself was targeted. And then the question became like, should the main Aave take care of this, right? And then how they kind of cut the damage was basically saying like, okay, for this Harmony one, like damage is onto whatever happened with Harmony mainnet, like it's now up to the main one. So maybe that was also something that I thought that if Maker is looking into such, then that's kind of one way of looking at it, where like maybe can have this kind of firewall, just a thought. But of course, I think that maybe for this one, especially like once especially it comes to voting, it might be worth to have more experts that also can provide some like a pro and con of it. I think would be quite cool.
Totally. I think it was a little short notice, but it would be amazing to get Derek's opinion here and Sam, because they both, I think, really thought deeply about it. I watched Sam's talk at ETH Warsaw that I also shared in the channel about Canonical DAI, and what I really liked about it is, I think Code Knight also said that in the chat that the risk is an L2 specific bug could result in infinite damage in there, while RepDAI would limit the amount of damage that could be done. And I think this kind of risk mitigation is even stronger with Canonical DAI, where basically everything is minted on ETH mainnet and then teleported to these other places. And this can be abstracted away to a large degree so that the user isn't like fully aware of it. And I think this is super powerful because it's something that no other stablecoin can do. I'm not fully sure how USDC is doing it. I mean, I think they're basically on a ton of chains at the moment. But does anybody know how they do that?
I mean, similar to others that are on multi-chain, like they can burn and mint through these different blockchains, right? But I mean, I also saw the comment from Code Knight saying that it might create a different stablecoin and for layer 2. But at the same time, like we also want to avoid a situation where there's like, for example, infinite mint, or even if it's like, the thing is that even if it's a rock, like there can be an error that basically mints an infinite one. Actually, to give some context, we had a similar discussion back at the foundation. I'm not sure whether I can say that, but but you can imagine that there was also concern, like even if you wrap it, there will be a possibility for like on another mainnet to be able to take advantage of it. Technically, you shouldn't be like, because for example, if you just make it there, like, okay, if you have, let's say like 1,000, let's say this layer 2 DAI, change it to 1,000, but then what happens if they, for example, have just one and mint it by 1,000? Then technically they maliciously exchange it and then there are 999 others that were technically should be able to redeem it, but they can't, right? So that also brings that question.
Yeah, that's a good point. And then I think Paper had a very interesting comment here that they, I think, have been doing work with on multi-chain. And I think the question about bridges is also one that we definitely need to consider. Like Derek also pointed out, should Maker build teleport, so basically its own bridge structure, or rely on these external bridges. And of course, external bridges always carry this additional risk. So I think maybe Paper, can you come on the mic to just talk a little bit about what we can consider there, because I'm not the most knowledgeable person here.
Sure. Yeah. So most of the work that GFX has done has been cross-chain governance. So that's made us familiar with message passing, right? That passing arbitrary messages through bridging infrastructure. So, bridges don't necessarily have to be just shoving a token in and getting a wrapped version on the other end. In fact, a lot of bridges really want to move away from that because it creates a honeypot hack for obvious reasons in the escrow. Like think about Maker Teleport. What's it really doing? It's just making a bridge that communicates between mainnet and an L2 saying burn here, mint there. I think August was talking about how for Circle, it's basically the same thing, but I think the way they do it is it's actually they've whitelisted bridges to interact with their mint and burn function so that it in theory travels through the back end, but it from a user perspective, it's the same thing. That your USDC on Avalanche goes away and you get your USDC on mainnet or vice versa. And there's no reason why Maker can't do this too. I mean, especially since that's exactly what Teleport was supposed to be. Now, this does come with risks, as were pointed out. That if there's you're assuming the security assumptions of the bridge and the chains that you're dealing with. So the others have thought about this because unfortunately Maker's not the one that all the new chains come to and say, hey, please get your stable zone on our chain. But like USDC and Frax and Tether, they do this a lot. And I think the solution that Frax has come up with is particularly clever for a conservative entity like Maker, which their Frax Ferry Bridge, which is kind of like their Maker Teleport. It only runs once a day and it has a limit to how much can go through. So they can never be like, they always have 24 hours to respond after an incident that catches them by surprise, so that you can't be constantly exploited and there's a limit to the damage. So given that Maker has, 70 million cash on hand, saying, oh, only 5 million can go through it a day. I mean, this is what we do with Teleport. It's just a matter of finding. The trouble is Teleport took so long to build and we can't get DAI in on the early days to establish market share on chains if we're going to rely on Teleport, which is like the battleship of, we need like support ships in the fleet, right? That the strategy needs to be more than that. So, finding there's a number of bridging partners, and maybe the best solution is to use two, so they can validate each other, like an MSIG made of bridges, right? Maybe oracles and another bridge could pair up to do burn mint functions, because then they both have to be exploited for there to be a bridge problem. So there's all kinds of mitigations that you can do about this stuff, whether it's limiting throttling the throughput, having multiple bridges involved to check each other's work. There's a lot of mitigations we can do, and these are I think solvable technical problems and risk management problems, and they're I think much simpler and more in Maker's wheelhouse to manage than a lot of the stuff we spend our time talking about. So I don't think we should be scared of this.
Mm-hmm. Yep. That's a really good point. I mean, that could basically mean that we start out with using other bridges that exist straight out of the gate, and if we see traction and success there, we deploy enough resources to develop our own solution that also allows us to scale up risk.
Hey guys, Derek here. I joined a little late and just caught the tail end of what Paper was saying there, but totally correct, agree with you. I don't know if you've seen the forum post, which I think Raf is what brought up this whole topic of conversation. What I'm trying to get to with that multi-chain strategy update is understand from a product perspective what the community wants, because we have a habit of getting sort of stuck in the weeds on the technical side of things, and I want to step up a level and go, what is it that we actually want from a product perspective? Are we, you know, as the community moves towards sub-DAOs, are we looking to supply DAI on an L1 and then have those sub-DAOs manage the DAI? What does the DAI product look like on L2? Is it another, like Paper was saying, is it other bridges? Is it HOP? Is it Connext? Is it a sub-DAO? Who owns it, runs it? What are the risks? And then what does the market space look like? How do we see that evolving from a product perspective? And then we can sort of backtrack and, you know, look at, does that mean we need teleport? Maybe we don't. Maybe we just have, like the Phoenix guys have been talking about, having a D3M. We inject DAI to the D3M on L1, and then they manage the L2 ecosystem. That's one solution. That's a very sort of the highest basic solution that could be, you know, implemented in this space. And then, you know, if we want to go further than that and have a VAT, have canonical DAI, so, you know, actually have, you know, mint rights, vault capabilities, that also introduces challenges around the scalability. Like Paper was saying, again, you know, it's taken us a long time to get to this teleport space. And, you know, do we see that scalable across, you know, Skull, ZK Sync, Polygon, and others? Or are we moving towards a space where that is actually managed by sub-DAOs? And I think that's a lot of the conversation that's happening in the community at the moment, which would be really good to understand from I guess, a perspective of prioritization and, you know, how we take that forward. So that's the post. I guess my request to everyone was just have a read. Don't get too worried about the technical side of things. Try to, if you can, come back to us with, what are you, from a community perspective, looking for on a product side of things? And then just ask questions like, what are the risks? What are the considerations, risk assumptions? What are we comfortable with? And then that'll help us kind of get to some, you know, product implementation that we can then sort of get our hands around. Because there's a bunch of different considerations, and I left the forum post relatively short. I had an extra sort of section that went into the depths of the technical side, but I think we need to settle on what is it we actually want. You know, where do you guys see the different ecosystems going? Do we know yet? Do we not? Do we want to keep it open for discussion? And does that lead us towards wrap DAI, canonical DAI, and the work that's going on in sub-DAO? So there's a few strings to pull on there. So I guess my call to the community is just to have a read, come back to us with questions. There's a lot of knowledge. The guys that have worked on Teleport have, you know, a huge amount of research backing the work that they've done, and understanding that we can build upon and, you know, get more understanding of the questions that you have. So feel free to do that, and we're here for any questions that you have.
Yeah. And then, you know, thanks so much for bringing it up. I believe that it's also a very important question from the strategy and also from growth as well. And I think, at least for me and Raphael, will be more also like general high-level guide, right? But yeah, curious about Raphael, your thoughts first, because mine is more, I think, simpler. So.
Yeah, thanks, Derek. I mean, I'm personally think that L2s are really important, just from capturing mind share, and there's also like pretty decent opportunities there, especially for early movers. And we've seen that work very well for a couple of other protocols. So I think as long as we can define the risks clearly and look at them carefully and just make sure we know where they are and have made plans to address them, then I think we're good. I just just think like blindly doing stuff isn't good, but it shouldn't hold us back to seizing growth opportunities. At least that's my personal opinion.
Yeah, I think regarding it, just my view is that like previously, like when I was a delegate, like I would vote in favor of, for example, teleport every time, right? But then I also think that from the if you're focusing on growth and looking at it, it's also about, as Derek also mentioned, it's about priority, right? Because growth is sure about expansion and experiment, but it's also about like being efficient, right? Like having our own bridge for Maker would make it more resilient, maybe, and also maybe more secure. But then that doesn't necessarily mean that being the most resilient is equals growth per se. And that's my kind of view. So I think it's a worthy discussion to talk about like, okay, I know that for a while we spent millions, especially working on teleport as in like Maker's own bridge. Maybe that's a path to go, but I think it's also worth to kind of explore like, is it better to just kind of have more risk parameters to make sure that our exposure can be limited? But instead of using our own bridge, which will also need to have a lot of security, because it's not like other bridges were insecure because they didn't spend enough money on security. It's just that they were able to find different ways to explore it, right? So I think we definitely need to have the discussion. Not from saying that like this is bad or good per se. It's more about like, okay, if you're thinking about growth, then we cannot allocate everything for all the resources. So is it like faster and also more efficient to just use other bridges? I think, and also go to layer 2. I think it's the path that we can also discuss.
I mean, I think maybe what's valuable for delegates regarding our strategy too is, so basically, are we opposed to using other bridges pending a rigorous risk review by the excellent people that Maker has in its community? Or is that something that we are basically supporting as long as it can lead to valuable growth opportunities?
I think that as growth, we should consider the clear timeline for it, because as Derek and others also mentioned, that we've been working on Tala for quite a while and we also have it up, but is it gaining as much attraction like attention as we hoped? And then also like is trying to expand it also worth it in terms of budget and the time and resource Maker has? I think it's something that we should consider. Also, I see that Nadia also brought an interesting point that so L2 Beat, they do help with all the data for, and then also the founders of the team also work for Maker actually, and then has advised on those. So maybe it's possible to potentially have them as an advisor / expert, or at least guest speaker to talk about this topic in the future, especially once it comes to voting, right? I think for now we're talking about the higher level, but eventually once it comes to voting or relate to the voting, I think that's when it actually like really matters, right?
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, right now there's no proposal to use any bridge, but I totally agree with you too that just from also my perspective of a Growth CVC member, I think I'd definitely not be disinclined to look at these proposals, and if the risk is manageable and we can find experts that can somehow attest to that, then it's definitely worth exploring that, just to move a little quicker than if we have to develop sorry teleport on every new chain that we want to interact with.
Yeah, actually, I mean, I know that maybe other CVC or ABC will have it, but I'm also kind of curious about the timeline for the because especially when I was at Growth for Maker, like teleport and everything should be in like finished by now, but in reality it's not. So I'm also kind of curious, like what's the updated like timeline for all of them? I mean, if there's one, and I'm not sure whether we can ask it, but it'd be nice if there's a way for the team to share it if they have it. All right. Rafael, it seems like that you also had another point. Do you want to continue the discussion? It has a
Totally.
part about independent vault or D3M.
Yeah. So I think one thing that I wanted to discuss is is dust limits. So what our position is there, if we kind of support lower dust limits. I mean, the gas environment is kind of very different from where it was half a year ago, but what would our position there be? I mean, I personally think that retail is somewhat important, but I also see maker car is not the right place for retail. So actually at the moment, I would not encourage lower dust limits, my personal opinion, and leave that to sub and metadAOs when they come online to be more retail friendly.
Yeah, okay. I think so. We're talking about the minimum amount that one needs to mint DAI, right? Is it correct? Okay, yeah. I mean, we had a discussion on the Discord about it. I think on the channel. I kind of on the view that the idea of DeFi is also make it more accessible, and also like that's also part of the growth. Like, it's true that the term growth, if you look at just from like DAI supply, those users might not be the ones that mint like millions. But at the same time, like in terms of users, right, that's where the growth can come from. And I think that we got a lot of feedbacks on, especially just on like Discord or back then Rocket Chat, that many try to mint it, but they can't because for a lot of people, a few thousand is still very big. So, I mean, if the reality is that to really balance the security and others, like it's just not possible, then okay, I respect that as well. But I think that we should also explore like, okay, like, is it especially from the growth in terms of user like number and also especially access to some of the newer markets, like is it something that's worth it? But you're also right that if you're talking about especially newer markets, then it itself has a high gas rate. So even if you lower it, like doesn't really make sense. So maybe it's more applicable for layer 2 as well as other mainnet solutions, right? Or even Maker's own mainnet. I know that also has been something that a lot of delegates also ask about, like what's our position on the Maker chain eventually, like if there's one. I'm not sure whether that's something that people are still curious about, but we can also share some if delegates are curious about our position on that.
Maybe I just one more point about dust limits. So I think the main reason they are that high is that it makes sure that we don't lose money in liquidations when times get rough, and that's usually why gas prices also peak. And I think what we could say, and I'd be down to discussing that, is that we say, let's look at the potential costs of lowering dust limits during a liquidation event, during like an extreme market downturn, and how many users that could bring us. And I think maybe we find a happy medium where we say, okay, if we lower the dust to, I don't know, from like half of what it is today for most wallets, then yes, it will cost us some money during liquidations, but it's actually worth it because we will gain a lot of users. We could totally run that experiment. I'll be up for that.
Yeah, but I mean, once again, I don't think there's a right or wrong answer per se, but also I did hear a lot of perspective that also says that maybe it's better to target toward layer 2 side, because as you mentioned, like, yes, layer 1 has a high dust, like a high minimum amount they need to mint it, but at the same time, like if they're so worried about that anyway, like gas fee itself would be very difficult for them, right? So it makes sense that those users can. I think one of the examples that we saw was like, for example, if you look at our retail users, like they're more likely to be on, for example, BNB or Polygon or those like a cheaper gas, right? And it makes sense, right? Because for those people, especially users, fee will be very important. So I think it makes more sense that for those users, maybe Mercury can let a target like a change with cheaper gas fee. Maybe that's the way to go. for them, you can have a lower dose limit because then you can also liquidate it easily without worrying about it.
But then if we talk about L2s in this context, that would mean that we have vaults on L2s, right? Like that whether we actually deploy those smart contracts on L2s. Because otherwise people can't mint there.
Yes and no. I think you're right that there would so especially people who are more technical can correct me or can tell me that I'm crazy. I'm crazy either way, but this is for technical one. Because I think you can, for example, have it that maker can partner with another one, but then they will be able to swap maker DAI into one-to-one, right? So because you can imagine that as long as the maker is willing to swap till a certain amount, then that's fine, right? So you can imagine if somebody, let's say, pretty common happens, like somebody decides to fork it and they decide to do a friendly fork. This is just an example, right? Somebody decides to do a friendly fork where our team, with the maker, also check the code, and then also in exchange they give a very huge amount of reward for maker community and something that they agree on, right? So then what they can do is that basically instead of maker itself going there, they can technically mint it, and then maker will be willing to, for example, swap it one-to-one to a certain degree. That might be possible, right? Just in theory.
That's super interesting. I mean, I think I think the question here is do we want people on L2s to just swap for DAI, or do we want them to be able to mint DAI on L2s, right? I think that's are very two different processes.
Yeah, but you can imagine that from the backend, they can make it almost like minting DAI, right? If they can swap one-to-one and there's no fee, and then it's just on a very cheap gas fee on layer 2, then from user side, there's no real difference. And then from the new project side, their benefit is that, well, their stablecoin probably is very unstable, right? At first, right? Because not many people trust it. But then if this is just an example, and I think this is an extreme example because I don't think it's going to happen in my lifetime, maybe 2 lives later, but it might happen someday, which is well, if that happens, that where maker community is very comfortable with this project, the fork maker code, then maybe it's possible that from the user side, there won't be actually difference between maker itself having both. But the benefit is that maker doesn't necessarily have to have a whole team just maintaining it on there. It would be like fork. And if there is a risk and let's say they get hacked, at least our damage is limited to how much we are willing to swap, right? So for example, if you say we're willing to swap till 30 million, okay, that's the maximum damage we can technically have. Besides reputation damage.
Yeah, totally agree. We need to set the right risk parameters there.
Okay, and then I also see the Cold Knight has brought up a question about, is leverage a desirable product for retail? I would say the product itself is neither desirable or not desirable. It's if somebody wants a service, I think we provide it. Although I do get liquidated a lot, but that's not, so don't be like me. But the point is that it also is something that has been expanding by use cases. Growth CVC incoming. Yeah, I think that's already there. Right. Anyway, I know that we talk about this topic a lot. Rafael, we have other topics to discuss, right? Especially on the MIP 104, right?
I'm currently don't really have much. I mean, DAI demand, we can touch on that. I think we have a couple of minutes left. So we could start growing DAI demand by basically incentivizing use on other decentralized exchanges. For instance, we have done some experiments with Velodrome. We could do experiments on GMX. The question is is that worth deploying funds or not? My personal take is yes, because just, for instance, boosting DAI liquidity on Velodrome is creating more users of DAI is good for Maker. But so I think maybe we can talk about the risks and caveats there a bit.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, especially for this, if I know Nadia's here, but Nadia is gonna leave the growth scope. So maybe if you can have somebody from the growth scope, especially talking about, we can have them, for example, maybe as a guest, or like if they're I think Nadia is here, but maybe just quickly, Drew, like, is it something that's kind of worthy, I would say, because I know that we have some votings I think might come up in the future, right, that are related to it. So like, is it something that they see as very helpful? I think that would be also useful for us to engage in.
I can, yeah, like Du said, I'm leading the growth core unit, but I can talk about Spark and also like growth, because I'm still in growth. So a growth core unit will evolve as other core units and will become into an ecosystem actor that is willing to provide services to the growth scope. And as we have seen how the scope is evolving, everything related to business development will not be there anymore, because that will be a responsibility of all the new sub-DAOs. So partnerships with OTCs and all others that you mentioned there in your document, that will be something that sub-DAOs will have to do, because Maker Core will be like a more simple structure and will have different needs. But I always think that ecosystem is super important, and I think that we should like grow Maker in L2s at least. So yeah, I think it will be very important somehow to like maintain Maker's presence in at least in Optimism and Arbitrum, and I think the growth scope should like include some like ideas on how, like a framework on how to treat like the airdrops that we have received from Optimism and Arbitrum, because in the end, this is something that will help Maker to grow there. But first, and that is why I suggested like to start talking with L2Bit or other experts in the L2's ecosystem to understand what should be Maker's future in regards to that. Like if sub-DAOs should like include L2s, which L2s, where to start. Like we are also thinking about launching like new farms for the sub-DAOs that should be on mainnet. It should be included in L2s. Like with Spark, it will be incredible to grow with Spark in L2s, like have Spark, not just on mainnet, but in Arbitrum and Optimism. And that is something that is, well, we can do that. So I think like there are a lot of options, but it will have to be decided by the frameworks that the growth scope and I suppose protocol engineer scope will define in the future regarding L2s.
Thanks, Nadia. That was really helpful.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, yeah, sorry to cut you off, Rafael. We can continue. I didn't mean to do that.
Yeah, I think that was basically it for today, at least from my point. Is there anything you wanted to add or any question for the delegates that we can answer?
Yeah, I just want to say that, you know, both Rafael and I, like we try our best to help Maker, as well as helping also delegates to better help the protocol. So if there are any, and it's once again early, right? And we're literally making changes. So thank you everybody for the feedback you guys are giving. And I think that we're getting the structure more and more. Okay, so Tim actually asked, do you have opinions on the weekly post? Did we do that already? So I think that some of it was brought up during on the Discord channel, but if you guys want to bring up like specifics, okay, actually, let me check. You know, it's time to change my laptop when it takes forever to load MakerGo. I don't know. Is there like
Maybe-
specific you know, proposal that you guys want to discuss? Maybe that might be easier.
maybe one thing that we discussed earlier during our call was that. So I think you mentioned that, and I really like that point about Growth CVC, that we are very inclusive and we're not gonna, pick out delegates for like minor issues. So I think basically, as long as it's not directly opposed to things we discussed here, I'm not gonna call for banning people, just personally.
Oh, are you talking about the? I mean, for me, it's like as long as they can defend this, like saying that it helps growth in a certain way, and as long as that Global Alpha team doesn't say that they're like clearly unconstitutional, like then I think it's fine. But I mean, if, for example, they vote in a way that directly contradicts it, and also is considered unconstitutional by Global Alpha, then yeah, that'd be tough. But at the same time, like I also think that at least I have a lot of trust in Global Alpha to also make the call that if, for example, certain delegates are being unconstitutional, it's not really up to us per se, because we're not the experts on the law. If I was, I'll go to law school and we'll do it here. So I think it makes sense for Global Alpha to deal with it. So if Global Alpha deems somebody unconstitutional, I think that especially if those delegates are associated with Growth ABC, at least I will still try to figure out like why exactly, right? Because I think it's early, so there might be misunderstanding. I want to give delegates benefit of doubts, and might be a mistake or misunderstanding. If it is not misunderstanding, then I think maybe we have to kind of think about it. But I don't want this ABC to be something that like just because somebody made a small mistake that they get kicked out. I mean, I'm not sure whether I can say it per se, but at least that's like how I kind of view it, unless it's like clearly unconstitutional. All right. I know that it's almost closing hour, but I remember Tim said that there are some like polls that you want to discuss. Like, is there any? So I just loaded up polls. I think there's 3 active ones. Like, do you want to talk about each one, or is there a specific one you want to discuss?
I just wanted to open space if there's anything you guys wanted to highlight. There's already some delegates who have Growth CVC specific delegations that have voted already. So I think it's probably best to just pin it and bring that to the forum for their communications because we're at time.
All right, sounds good. Then yeah, let's do that. I mean, we also have the Discord channel, so I know that others have other commitments. So is it okay, Rafael, if you just wrap up here?
Yeah, fine for me. Thanks a lot. Thanks everybody. That was
much
super
for everyone.
productive.
Yes, thank you. All right, then thank you everyone, and let's continue the conversation on Discord and forum.